So given the impossibility, basically, of developing the arguments within our 15 minutes, which I have promised to keep, I thought it may be useful to reverse the order usual and start by outlining the basic points that I would like to make here today. To summarize, perhaps the most basic issues that I would like to convey would be, first, to argue for the pervasiveness of the notion of political subjectivity, in the sense that political subjectivity is not a term meant to capture or describe a certain aspect of subjectivity, but indeed subjectivity as such needs to be understood as political. And two, the second point, which is in fact an extension of the first one, is that the political nature of subjectivity is not limited to extreme, exotic, or unique states of personal or collective experience. This point would suggest that while such contexts as psychosis or colonial history indeed offer special occasions for examination of the effects or manifestations of the political within the subjective, it is useful, in fact imperative for us, to train our attention on the much broader and pervasive presence of the political within the everyday experience of the individual that we study. And three, finally, I would like to make the case that of the many disciplines and areas of engagement with human experiences to whom the notion of political subjectivity is of direct relevance, psychological anthropologists occupy the most privileged spot for addressing and theorizing the issue of political subjectivity. And I would urge us all to shift a good part of our collective attention to developing the very significant yet very underdeveloped area of research, theory, and analysis on political subjectivity. Anyone who has looked at the abstracts for our talks today will have noticed that I have specifically singled out the two disciplines of psychoanalysis and anthropology with regard to the question of political subjectivity. I do think we are well justified to do so for a host of reasons, including what Byron has just told us in terms of the specifically powerful conceptual tools developed within the French and in general, and specifically Lacanian psychoanalytic tradition. The basic reason why I have singled out these two disciplines is that in order to most accurately trace the political within the subjective, the discussion takes us to basic psychological theories, the majority of which can be understood as developmental theories, and all of which take place at the interface of the individual and the collective. On the other hand, or better, on the other side of the same coin lies the fact that it is in analyzing the seat and the nature of subjectivity that psychoanalysis and anthropology have come to see each other eye to eye. That, of course, is a different discussion, so let's pass that. One central topic in discussing political subjectivity that I would like to highlight here is the relationship between power and meaning, or at least two significant aspects of that relationship, namely the fundamental role of that interaction in the work of culture, and secondly, the constitutive role of that relationship in the development of human subjectivity. As I mentioned at the opening, the subject is political in its very subjectivity, both in the sense that it engages in an ongoing act of subjugating or conjugating the world into meaningful and temporal patterns, and in the sense that it is subjugated and conjugated by meaning systems in order to become and remain a social subject. That is to say, politicality is not an added aspect of the subject, but indeed the mode of being the subject. That is, what the subject is and how the subject is. As I mentioned, the basic sense in which the subject is political in its daily existence is that the subject comes to be through the continuous act of interpretation and being interpreted. Or in other words, the location of the political is in the process of making meaning, the process whereby one makes sense and is made sense of by the other. Meaning is always already political and imbued with power. That is to say, the subject is political because it is the subject of meaning, and meaning is always political because it is always the representation of a specific interest. This, of course, does not mean the conscious interest of a specific group or class, as in the interest of a state or a ruling class, but it is always an interest, and always the interest commonly shared by a group of people. There are a few dimensions of meaning which become quite relevant in this account. For instance, that, as Saussure has taught us, meaning is only possible through negativity. In other words, it is produced through a system of differences or negations between signifiers. That it always exists within and functions through a network of various levels of configurations, and that as such it is always vested with interest. That is to say, certain configurations of meaning, certain groups of associations are privileged in any given meaning system over certain other possible configurations and associative patterns. This basic framework in many ways offers an excellent model for a post-Foucauldian formulation of power. And of course, by saying post-Foucauldian, I do not mean to suggest something that rejects Foucault's understanding of power, but something that builds on what he did, which I understand as liberation or liberating the concept of power from its linear and hierarchical or centered model, and takes us the next small step to formulating the notion of power, something perhaps Foucault would have done himself. As he taught us, power does not function through repressing or concealing the truth, but rather through creating regimes of truth. To put it in his own words, the political question is not about error, illusion, alienated consciousness, or ideology. It is about truth itself. This model obviously has fundamental implications for the whole tradition of politics of emancipation and the range of associated theoretic and ideological stances, such as critical theory and Marxism, etc. Because in this model there is nothing to be emancipated, no truth is repressed to be liberated, no essence is concealed to be uncovered. But he of course also became the target of criticism that focused in different terms on the basic idea that if power establishes the regime of truth, establishes the subject as such, and if power is omnipresent as Foucault is telling us it is, then how are we ever to understand and theorize the possibility of resistance? So here is one excellent instance of where psychoanalysis, Lacanian psychoanalysis to be specific, becomes involved, which formulates, specifically Lacanian psychoanalysis, which formulates the subject in linguistic terms, and in doing so opens the way for convergence of a few very interesting and very important themes of analysis, including power, meaning, desire, and of course resistance. So the formulation of power through the mechanisms of meaning offers a solution to the problem of resistance in Foucault, given that it calls in the notion of negativity as an emptiness that lies at the center of the fullness of meaning. I do not have the luxury of getting, obviously, into a detailed discussion of this, but as we know, this is precisely where the discussion converges with the Lacanian formulation of the subject and its formation within and through the structures of meaning and symbolic order. And always already containing that negativity, the lack that on the one hand calls for and makes possible the process of identity and meaning making itself, and on the other prevents the fullness of meaning and the finality of identity. Let us keep in mind, for instance, the central role of the original loss and its symbolic counterpart, namely prohibition, or what Lacan terms so wonderfully the name of or the no of the Father, in initiating on the one hand the process of meaning making, and on the other the process of ego formation and self-identification. To put it in Judith Butler's words, I'm quoting, "One cannot account for subjectivation and in particular becoming the principle of one's own subjection without recourse to a psychoanalytic account of the formative or generative effects of restriction and prohibition." And then let's keep in mind also that this it is precisely that law of prohibition that produces the desire to transgress. Or in other words, that initiates the political dynamics of power and resistance. So, to recap then, once we have established that meaning is basically the vehicle and as such always a manifestation of power, and I'm not really claiming that I have done so here, established that here, but I believe I have presented the basic elements of that argument at least. And once we converge that with the Lacanian theory of subjectivity, which conceives of the subject as fundamentally embedded in, sustained by, and a manifestation of the orders of law and meaning, this has a number of significant consequences, including that process of subjectivity becomes always already political, and that in order to examine subjectivity in its political reality, we will need to engage an analysis of the structures of meaning, which in turn calls for new analytic models in our work. Another discussion. And to go back to the problem of resistance, which I also think should hold a very clear significance in both anthropological and psychological theories of the subject, we need to pay attention to the basic conclusion that, like meaning and like subject's identity, and for much the same reasons, power is always incomplete, is never final, and is always subject to slippage. One basic implication of this simple fact is then that in order for us to understand the process of assertion of power and resistance to it, to understand the political, in other words, we need to focus our attention not just on the macro-political world of social and historical facts, but also, if not more so, on the subject simultaneously thriving within and struggling against that world. And of course, the reverse of this holds as strongly, namely that if we want to develop an accurate understanding of the processes of subjectivity or intersubjective relations, we can no longer afford to avoid the macro-political world inhabited by those subjects, regardless of where the subject is and what kinds of political histories and realities they have to come to terms with in order to survive as social subjects. Thank you.
Time, and